My sister lost my heirloom wedding rings hours before my ceremony and replaced them with cheap silver bands. Months later, I found out that she plans to use my rings at her own wedding. My sister called me crying 2 hours before my wedding ceremony, saying she'd lost my rings somewhere between the hotel and the venue. She was my maid of honor, and I'd trusted her with my grandmother's diamond ring that had been resized 3 times to fit perfectly. "I've looked everywhere," she sobbed on the phone while I sat in the bridal suite. "I must have dropped the ring box somewhere. But don't worry, I have a solution." She showed up 30 minutes later with a different set of rings, plain silver bands from a jewelry store downtown. "These are beautiful too," she said, not meeting my eyes. "They'll work perfectly for the ceremony, and we can keep looking for grandmother's ring after." I didn't have time to argue. 200 guests were waiting. My husband, Kyle, noticed immediately at the altar. "Where's your grandmother's ring?" he whispered during the prayer. "Later," I mouthed back. The ceremony continued with those substitute rings while my sister stood behind me, dabbing her eyes like she was so moved by the vows. 3 months passed and she never found my rings. She helped me file an insurance claim that got denied because I couldn't prove the rings were actually lost versus stolen. "These things happen," she kept saying whenever I brought it up. "At least you have rings that symbolize your love." Then her own wedding arrived 8 months later. She'd gotten engaged right after mine to her boyfriend Thomas, who everyone knew was loaded from his tech startup. She asked me to be her matron of honor, which felt obligatory after I'd chosen her. The morning of her wedding, I went to her bridal suite early to help with setup. The photographer was already there arranging detail shots on the marble dresser. The shoes, the veil, the invitation suite, and there in a blue velvet box sat 2 rings. My stomach dropped. I knew that diamond pattern. Those tiny sapphires around the band that spelled out something in Morse code my grandmother had never told anyone. "Beautiful rings," the photographer said, adjusting her camera. The bride said they're family heirlooms. So much history in these pieces. I picked up the ring box. My hands were shaking. "Where did these come from?" I asked the photographer. "Oh, the groom dropped them off. Said the bride wanted them photographed separately because they're so special." My sister walked in wearing her robe, saw me holding the box, and froze. "Why are you touching those?" she asked, her voice too high. "These are my rings," I said slowly. "These are grandmother's rings that you lost at my wedding." "That's impossible," she said, but her face had gone pale. "Those are different rings. Thomas bought them from an estate sale." "Estate sale?" I turned the ring over. There on the inside band was the inscription my husband had added. Forever KSL. His initials and mine. "Then why does it have my wedding inscription?" The photographer lowered her camera. 2 bridesmaids who'd just arrived stood in the doorway staring. "We need to talk privately," my sister hissed. "No," I said. "We're talking right now. You took my rings. You stole them from my wedding and gave me those cheap bands that I just found out were the placeholder rings you'd bought for your own wedding before Thomas upgraded them." "You're being ridiculous," she said, reaching for the rings. I stepped back. "Those rings you gave me? I had them appraised last month for insurance. The jeweler said they had an inscription filed off. Want to guess what he could still make out? T&R 2024. Thomas and Rebecca. Your initials." The bridesmaids gasped. My sister's maid of honor, her college roommate Diana, spoke up. "Rebecca, didn't you tell me you were planning to use vintage rings until Thomas insisted on buying new ones?" "Shut up, Diana," my sister snapped. "So you took my grandmother's rings, gave me your reject rings, and planned to wear mine at your wedding?" I asked. "You watched me cry for months about losing a family heirloom and you had them the whole time?" "I deserve something nice too," she exploded. "You got everything growing up. Grandmother always loved you more. She would have wanted me to have these rings if she knew how successful Thomas is. You married someone who makes $40,000 a year? These rings deserve better than that." The room went silent. Even the photographer had stopped taking pictures. You stole from me because you think my husband isn't rich enough for grandmother's rings?" I asked. "I didn't steal anything," she said desperately. "I was going to give them back eventually. After my wedding, I just wanted to wear them once." "Give them back?" I laughed. "You were going to wear my wedding rings at your wedding, and then what? Pretend you found them in your closet?" Thomas walked in wearing his tux. "What's going on?" Thomas stopped just inside the doorway, and his eyes moved from me holding the ring box to Rebecca, whose face had gone completely white. He looked confused for a second before his expression changed to something harder. Rebecca reached for his arm, but he stepped back from her, keeping distance between them. His voice came out quiet when he asked what I was talking about. I held up the rings so he could see them clearly. The diamonds caught the light from the photographer's setup, and I watched Thomas recognize them as the rings he thought Rebecca had bought from an estate sale. I started explaining everything while the bridesmaids and Moira stood frozen watching us. I told him how Rebecca was my maid of honor 8 months ago, and how she called me 2 hours before my ceremony saying she'd lost my grandmother's rings somewhere between the hotel and venue, how she showed up with different rings, plain silver bands that she said I could use for the ceremony while we kept looking, how those 3 months passed and she never found my rings, how she helped me file an insurance claim that got denied, how those replacement rings she gave me turned out to be her own placeholder rings with a filed-off inscription that read, T&R 2024. Thomas's face changed with every detail I gave him. His jaw got tight and his hands curled into fists at his sides. One of the bridesmaids made a small noise, but nobody interrupted me. I explained how I'd found my grandmother's rings this morning in Rebecca's bridal suite, how the photographer told me the groom had dropped them off for pictures, how Rebecca tried to claim they were different rings from an estate sale until I showed her the inscription inside. Thomas moved forward and picked up the rings from where I'd set them on the dresser. His hands were shaking as he turned the engagement ring over and read the inscription on the inside of the band out loud. Forever, KSL. His voice barely made it above a whisper when he looked at Rebecca and asked if this was true. Rebecca started crying immediately, big tears running down her face and ruining her makeup. She tried to explain between sobs that she was going to give them back eventually, that she just wanted to wear something special for her wedding day, that grandmother would have wanted her to have nice things too. She reached for Thomas, but he set the rings down on the dresser and walked out of the bridal suite without saying another word. The door clicked shut behind him, and Rebecca stood there staring at it like she couldn't believe what just happened. Diana stepped forward and told Rebecca she needed to come clean about everything right now. The other bridesmaids were whispering to each other in the corner, and Moira had completely stopped taking pictures, her camera hanging around her neck while she watched everything unfold. I was still holding the ring box, and my whole body was shaking with 8 months of anger that I'd been pushing down. Every time Rebecca had looked at me with fake sympathy while I talked about losing grandmother's ring. Every time she'd patted my hand and said these things happen. Every time she'd helped me search for rings she knew were sitting in her apartment the whole time. I told Rebecca I was taking my rings and leaving and she could figure out what to do about her wedding. She spun around and grabbed my arm, begging me not to ruin her special day. She said we could sort this out after the ceremony, that she'd make it right, that I just needed to let her get married first. I actually laughed because she was still trying to manipulate me even now, still trying to make this about her needs and her timeline like she hadn't stolen from me and lied for 8 months. I pulled my arm away and put the rings in my purse. Rebecca kept talking, saying things about family and forgiveness and how I was being cruel. Diana looked uncomfortable but didn't defend Rebecca this time. The door burst open and Victor, the wedding planner, rushed in asking what was wrong. He had his tablet in one hand and a headset around his neck and he looked stressed. He said the ceremony started in 90 minutes and guests were starting to arrive downstairs. Heather, one of the bridesmaids standing by the window, blurted out that the bride stole the maid of honor's wedding rings. Victor stopped moving and looked at Rebecca with complete disbelief on his face. He asked if this was some kind of joke, looking around the room like someone would tell him it was a prank. Nobody said anything. Rebecca just stood there crying, and Victor's expression changed from confused to understanding. He asked Rebecca if it was true in this careful voice. Rebecca didn't answer him. I walked past Victor and out of the bridal suite with my grandmother's rings secure in my purse. My hands were still shaking as I pulled out my phone and called Kyle. He answered on the second ring and I told him I needed him in the hotel lobby right now. He said he was already at the venue as a guest and would be there in 2 minutes. I took the elevator down and stood in the marble lobby watching people in wedding clothes walk past me. So Kyle came through the main doors exactly 2 minutes later, still wearing his suit from getting ready for the ceremony. He saw my face and came straight to me. I showed him the rings and told him everything that happened upstairs, about finding them in Rebecca's bridal suite, about the inscription, about Rebecca's confession in front of everyone, about Thomas walking out. Kyle wrapped me in a hug and said we were going straight to a lawyer. I could feel his heart beating fast against my cheek, and his arms were tight around me like he was trying to hold me together. We were standing there when Thomas came out of the elevator. He looked around the lobby until he spotted us and then walked over. He asked if we could talk privately. Kyle looked at me and I nodded, so we followed Thomas to a quiet corner near the windows away from other people. Thomas apologized over and over, saying he had no idea Rebecca had stolen from me. He looked completely destroyed, his face pale and his eyes red like he'd been crying. He kept asking how she could do something like this, how she could steal from her own sister and lie about it for 8 months. I didn't have an answer for him. Kyle kept his hand on my back the whole time, steady and solid. Thomas took a deep breath and told us he was calling off the wedding. He said he couldn't marry someone who would steal from family and lie about it for months. He asked if I was going to press charges against Rebecca. I told him I hadn't decided yet, but I was definitely talking to a lawyer today. Thomas nodded and said he understood whatever I chose to do. He apologized one more time before walking away toward the hotel bar. Kyle and I stood there in that quiet corner while wedding guests kept arriving through the main doors, completely unaware that there wasn't going to be a ceremony. Kyle grabbed my hand and we walked toward the main entrance while behind us I could hear Rebecca's voice getting louder and higher pitched. She was screaming something about how I'd ruined everything, and how could I do this to her on her wedding day. Other guests were coming through the doors now, dressed up and carrying gift bags, their faces confused as they saw people standing around the lobby instead of heading to the ceremony space. A woman in a purple dress asked someone near the elevators where the wedding was happening, and the hotel staff member looked uncomfortable and said something quietly to her. Kyle and I pushed through the revolving door and the cold air hit my face. My hands were still shaking as I clutched my purse with grandmother's rings inside. We got to Kyle's car in the parking garage, and he opened my door first before going around to the driver's side. He started the engine and looked at me, asking where we should go. I told him we needed to go to his mom's house because Lisa was a paralegal, and she'd know what to do about this. The drive took 20 minutes through Saturday afternoon traffic, and neither of us said much. I kept checking my purse to make sure the ring box was still there, like it might disappear again if I wasn't careful. We pulled into Lisa's driveway, and she came to the door still wearing her gardening gloves. She took one look at our faces and pulled us inside, asking what happened. Kyle told her we'd explain everything, but we needed her legal advice right now. We sat at her kitchen table, and I pulled out the ring box, opening it to show her grandmother's rings. Lisa picked up the engagement ring carefully, turning it to see the inscription inside. I explained the whole story while she listened, her expression getting more serious with each detail. I showed her the photos I'd taken on my phone of the cheap silver bands Rebecca had given me, zooming in on the spot where the jeweler said he could still make out the filed inscription. Lisa set down the ring and told us this was clear theft, no question about it. She said I had multiple witnesses who heard Rebecca admit to taking the rings and lying about it for 8 months. She got up and went to her home office, coming back with a business card for a lawyer named Jane Estrada, who handled family disputes and property crimes. Lisa said Jane was tough and fair and would take this case seriously. She wrote Jane's cell number on the back of the card and told me to call her today, not Monday, because this was time sensitive. My phone started buzzing in my purse, and when I pulled it out, I had 17 missed calls and 32 text messages. My Aunt Carol had texted asking what was going on at the wedding. My cousin Jennifer wanted to know why people were saying the ceremony was canceled. My Uncle Mike sent a message saying Rebecca was hysterical, and someone needed to explain what happened. Then my mom called, and I answered it. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. She kept asking why I would ruin Rebecca's wedding day. How could I be so cruel to my own sister? What was I thinking causing a scene like that? I waited until she stopped talking, and then I told her Rebecca ruined it herself by stealing my wedding rings 8 months ago. I said I just found out this morning that she'd planned to wear my rings at her own wedding after watching me cry about losing them for months. My mom went quiet for a second and then said, "There must be some misunderstanding. Rebecca would never do something like that." I told her there was no misunderstanding because Rebecca admitted everything in front of 6 witnesses, including the photographer and Thomas. My mom started crying harder and said we needed to work this out as a family, not involve lawyers or make this bigger than it needed to be. I told her I'd talk to her later and hung up. Kyle's mom looked at me and said my family's reaction was typical, but I shouldn't let it stop me from pursuing this legally. She said Rebecca had committed a crime and there needed to be consequences. I called Jane Estrada's cell number and she answered on the 3rd ring. I explained who I was and that Lisa had given me her number. Then I told her the basic facts of what happened. Jane asked a few questions about the timeline and the witnesses and whether I had any documentation. I told her about the photos of both ring sets, the jeweler's appraisal of the cheap bands, the inscription inside grandmother's ring, and the 6 people who heard Rebecca's confession. Jane said she could see me Monday morning at 9 for a full consultation. She said from what I'd described, I had a strong case for both criminal theft charges and a civil lawsuit to recover damages for emotional distress. She told me not to talk to Rebecca or her representatives without her present, and to document everything from this point forward. I thanked her and hung up, feeling like things were finally moving in the right direction. Kyle and I stayed at his mom's house for another hour while she helped me write down everything I could remember about the confrontation in Rebecca's bridal suite. She said details would matter in court, and I needed to get it all on paper while it was fresh. We drove home around 6 that evening and I felt exhausted, like I'd been awake for days instead of just one very long day. My phone kept buzzing with more calls and texts from family members, but I ignored most of them. Then Diana called and I answered because she'd been in the room when everything happened. Diana told me the wedding was officially canceled and most of the guests had gone home confused. The hotel had put out a statement saying there was a family emergency and the ceremony wouldn't be taking place. Diana apologized for not believing me sooner about the rings. She said Rebecca had been acting strange for months whenever anyone asked about where she got her wedding rings, always changing the subject or getting defensive. Diana admitted she'd thought it was weird but hadn't connected it to my missing rings until today. She said she felt terrible for not saying something earlier. I told her it wasn't her fault because Rebecca had fooled everyone. Diana said she was going to give a statement to the police if I decided to press charges because what Rebecca did was wrong. We hung up and I sat on my couch with Kyle next to me, both of us just processing everything that had happened. The next day, Thomas called asking if he could meet with Kyle and me. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop halfway between our places. Thomas showed up looking like he hadn't slept at all, his eyes red and his hair messy. We got our drinks and sat at a table in the back corner away from other people. Thomas kept apologizing over and over, saying he'd been going through Rebecca's things at their apartment and finding other items she'd lied about or taken from people. He showed us his phone where he'd photographed a bracelet that belonged to his sister, a watch his mom had been looking for, and some expensive headphones from his best man Cornelius. Thomas said he'd been blind to who Rebecca really was, and he felt sick about it. Then he pulled out a folder of papers from his messenger bag. He showed us receipts and bank statements proving Rebecca had told him the wedding rings were from an estate sale. He'd paid her $12,000 thinking she'd bought them herself with his money. Thomas said he wanted to give me that $12,000 as partial compensation for what Rebecca put me through. He also said he'd testify against Rebecca if I pressed charges because she'd stolen from me and lied to both of us. Kyle and I looked at each other and I told Thomas we appreciated his support. Thomas signed a statement right there at the coffee shop describing everything Rebecca had told him about the rings and how much he'd paid her. Monday morning came and I met Jane Estrada at her office downtown. She was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with short dark hair and a no-nonsense way of talking. We sat in her conference room and I went through the entire story again, this time with Jane taking detailed notes. She asked to see the rings and examined them carefully, taking photos of the inscription. She looked at all my documentation, including the photos of Rebecca's placeholder bands, the jeweler's appraisal, Thomas's statement and receipts, and the list of witnesses. Jane told me I had an overwhelming case, and she recommended pursuing both criminal charges for theft and a civil lawsuit. She explained it would be hard because Rebecca was family, and that always made things messy. She said my parents would probably pressure me to drop it, and other relatives might take sides. But she also said the evidence was so strong that we'd likely win both cases. She asked what I wanted to achieve from this, and I told her I wanted Rebecca to face real consequences for what she did. Jane nodded and said she'd file the paperwork that afternoon. We left her office and went straight to the police station to file a formal report. The officer who took my statement was patient and thorough, writing down every detail. He said they'd contact the witnesses to verify my account. Over the next few days, the police reached out to Moira, the photographer, who confirmed everything she'd witnessed and heard in the bridal suite. Diana and Heather both gave statements supporting my version of events. The other bridesmaids who'd been there also provided their accounts. By Thursday, Jane called to tell me the police had enough evidence to move forward with charges. She said Rebecca's lawyer had already contacted her trying to negotiate. Rebecca wanted to avoid criminal charges and was offering to pay restitution. Jane told them we'd consider it, but only if Rebecca made a formal written confession first and paid for all my legal fees plus damages. She said Rebecca's lawyer sounded desperate, which meant Rebecca was finally understanding how serious this was. That same evening, my mom called. Her voice was shaking, and I could hear my dad in the background telling her what to say. She begged me to drop the charges because this would destroy Rebecca's life and reputation. She said Rebecca made a mistake, but didn't deserve to have a criminal record over family jewelry. I told her Rebecca destroyed 8 months of my life by making me think I'd lost grandmother's rings through my own carelessness. I explained how I cried myself to sleep for weeks feeling guilty. I reminded her that Rebecca watched me file a false insurance claim while she had my rings in her apartment the whole time. My mom started crying harder and said I was being cruel and unforgiving. My dad got on the phone and said I needed to think about the family's reputation and what people would say. I hung up on him. Kyle held my hand while I sat on our couch trying not to shake from anger. The next morning, Thomas called. His voice sounded hollow and tired, like he hadn't slept. He told me he'd officially broken up with Rebecca and moved out of their apartment that morning. He said he couldn't be with someone who would steal from her own sister and lie about it for months. He asked if I still wanted his support for the case, and I told him yes. He said he'd already given a full statement to the police about the $12,000 he paid Rebecca, thinking the rings came from an estate sale. He explained how she'd shown him fake receipts and lied about the rings' history. Thomas said his lawyer would be in touch with Jane to coordinate everything. I thanked him and told him I was sorry his wedding got destroyed, but glad he found out who Rebecca really was before marrying her. He said he was grateful too, even though it hurt. 3 days later, Jane called with news. Rebecca had agreed to write a formal confession admitting everything. Jane said Rebecca's lawyer pushed hard for this because without the confession, Rebecca would face much worse charges at trial. The confession arrived by courier that afternoon. I sat at our kitchen table reading Rebecca's notarized statement, admitting she took the rings from the ring box before my wedding ceremony. She confessed to replacing them with her own placeholder bands. She admitted lying about losing the rings and planning to wear them at her own wedding. She acknowledged filing a false insurance claim. The words were there in black and white with her signature at the bottom. Kyle read it over my shoulder and squeezed my hand. Jane submitted the confession to both the criminal court and our civil lawsuit. 2 days after that, the insurance company called. The claims adjuster apologized for denying my original claim. She explained they'd seen the police report and Rebecca's confession proving theft. She said they wanted to reopen my case now that fraud had been proven. She asked if I wanted to pursue a claim against Rebecca through their fraud investigation department. I told her I'd think about it and call back. When I discussed it with Jane, she said letting the insurance company pursue their own fraud case would add another layer of legal trouble for Rebecca. She explained it would strengthen my position in the civil lawsuit because it showed a pattern of dishonest behavior. I called the insurance company back and told them to go ahead with their investigation. The weekend came and Kyle suggested we visit the jeweler who originally resized grandmother's ring for me. We drove downtown to the small shop where I'd gone 3 times to get the ring fitted perfectly. The jeweler was an older man named Mr. Estrada, who remembered me immediately. He examined the ring carefully under his magnifying glass. He found his own tiny engraving mark inside the band that he puts on every piece he works on. He smiled and said it was definitely the same ring. He wrote out a detailed statement about the ring's history and the work he'd done on it. He included information about the ring's value and the unique characteristics that made it identifiable. He said he'd be happy to testify in court if needed. Kyle and I thanked him and left with the statement for Jane. Monday morning, Jane called with a settlement offer from Rebecca's lawyer. $30,000 plus full payment of all my legal fees. Jane explained this was actually reasonable given the emotional distress Rebecca caused me. She listed out the cost of the replacement rings Rebecca gave me, my legal fees, the 8 months of pain and anxiety, and the damage to family relationships. She said we could push for more at trial, but this was a solid offer. I thought about it for 2 days. The money mattered less to me than making sure everyone knew what Rebecca had done. I told Jane I'd accept the settlement, but only if Rebecca wrote a letter to our entire extended family explaining everything. Jane said that was an unusual condition, but she'd present it to Rebecca's lawyer. Rebecca agreed within hours. She must have been desperate to avoid a trial. I worked with Jane to outline what the letter needed to include. Rebecca had to admit stealing the rings, lying about losing them, filing a false insurance claim, and planning to wear my rings at her wedding. She had to explain her motivations and apologize. The letter had to go to every aunt, uncle, cousin, and grandparent in our family. Rebecca's lawyer sent over the draft letter for my approval. I made her revise it twice to remove excuses and victim language. The final version was honest and direct. Rebecca admitted everything without trying to minimize what she'd done. Jane had it sent to our entire family by email and certified mail. My phone started ringing within hours. My mom called crying and apologizing for not believing me at first. She said she'd been in denial about how bad Rebecca's behavior really was. Several aunts and uncles reached out offering support and expressing shock. My cousin Jennifer said she always knew Rebecca was jealous, but never imagined she'd do something this terrible. My grandmother's sister called and said grandmother would be proud of me for fighting to get the rings back. Meanwhile, the criminal charges kept moving forward despite the civil settlement. Jane explained that the prosecutor's office doesn't drop theft and fraud charges just because of a private settlement. The prosecutor told Jane this case involved clear criminal behavior that needed consequences. Rebecca's lawyer negotiated a plea deal to avoid trial. Rebecca agreed to plead guilty to misdemeanor theft and fraud charges. The deal included 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and mandatory counseling. Jane said this was actually a good outcome for Rebecca, because felony charges would have destroyed her career prospects completely. The plea hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Thomas called me 2 weeks after the plea hearing and asked if we could meet for coffee. Kyle came with me because I wasn't ready to see Thomas alone after everything. We met at a quiet cafe downtown on a Tuesday afternoon. Thomas looked thinner than I remembered and had dark circles under his eyes. He apologized for what Rebecca had done even though none of it was his fault. He said he was glad he found out who she really was before they got married. Then he mentioned he'd started dating someone from his company, a woman named Sarah who worked in his marketing department. He seemed lighter talking about her, like he'd escaped something terrible. Kyle and I left that meeting feeling like Thomas was going to be okay. The next day, I took grandmother's rings to the jeweler who'd originally resized them for me. He cleaned them carefully with special solutions and inspected every prong and setting under his magnifying equipment. He told me they were in perfect condition, despite everything they'd been through. I started wearing the engagement ring again that same afternoon. It felt strange at first after 8 months of wearing Rebecca's cheap replacement band. But by evening it felt right again, like it belonged on my finger. Kyle noticed immediately when I got home and kissed my hand where the ring sat. We used part of the settlement money to book a delayed honeymoon trip we couldn't afford right after our wedding. 2 weeks in Italy visiting Rome, Florence, and the Amalfi Coast. We left in early spring when the weather was perfect, and the tourist crowds were smaller. I wore grandmother's ring the whole time, finally able to enjoy what it represented without the pain of thinking it was lost forever. We took photos at the Trevi Fountain and the Colosseum with my hand positioned so the ring showed clearly in every shot. Kyle joked that we were making up for lost time, and I agreed. The trip felt like a reset button on our marriage, washing away the stress and anger from the past year. Diana called me while we were in Florence to update me on Rebecca. She said Rebecca had started her community service at a nonprofit that helped crime victims, which felt like appropriate irony. Diana said Rebecca seemed genuinely remorseful now, attending her counseling sessions and completing her service hours without complaint. But Diana also said she understood why I couldn't forgive Rebecca anytime soon. I appreciated Diana's honesty about the whole situation. She'd been caught in the middle but had chosen to tell the truth when it mattered. My relationship with my parents slowly improved after we got back from Italy. My dad called and asked if he could take Kyle and me to dinner. We met at a steakhouse near their house, and Dad admitted he'd always known Rebecca was jealous of me. He said he never imagined she'd go this far, though, that he thought it was just normal sibling rivalry. He apologized for not believing me right away when I found the rings at Rebecca's wedding. My mom cried through most of the dinner and promised they'd stop pressuring me to reconcile with Rebecca. They said they understood I needed time and space to heal from what she'd done. The insurance fraud investigation wrapped up 3 months after the plea hearing. Rebecca had to pay back the insurance company for their investigation costs on top of everything else. Jane called to tell me the news and said this, combined with the criminal record and civil judgment, meant Rebecca had faced real consequences for her actions. The insurance company also formally apologized to me for denying my original claim and offered a small settlement for their mistake. I accepted it because it felt like another piece of justice. I started seeing a therapist in May to work through the betrayal and trust issues this whole situation had created. Her office was in a quiet building downtown with comfortable chairs and soft lighting. She helped me understand that Rebecca's actions were about her own insecurity and entitlement, not anything I'd done wrong. We talked about how grandmother had always treated us equally, but Rebecca had perceived favoritism that didn't exist. The sessions helped me let go of some of the anger I'd been carrying around for months. I still felt hurt and betrayed, but it wasn't consuming me anymore. 6 months after Rebecca's canceled wedding, I ran into her at our great-aunt's funeral. The service was at a small church across town, and I didn't expect Rebecca to show up. But there she was in a black dress sitting 3 rows ahead of us. We were polite but distant during the reception afterward. She looked like she wanted to talk, but I wasn't ready yet. Kyle stayed close to me the whole time, providing silent support without being obvious about it. Rebecca left early, and I felt relieved. Thomas sent me a message in August saying he'd gotten engaged to Sarah after dating for 4 months. He included an invitation to their small ceremony in September and said he'd understand if we didn't want to come. But he wanted us to know he'd found real happiness with someone honest. Kyle and I talked about it for a few days before deciding to attend. Thomas had been a victim in this situation too and deserved support. The wedding was at a garden venue with maybe 50 guests total. Sarah was kind and genuine when we met her before the ceremony. She knew the whole story about Rebecca and the rings and told me she was sorry for what I'd been put through. She said Thomas had been completely honest with her about everything from their first date. Watching Thomas get married to someone honest made me feel like justice had been served in an unexpected way. He looked happier than I'd ever seen him with Rebecca. During the reception, Thomas came over to thank us for coming and said it meant a lot that we'd supported him through everything. A few weeks after Thomas's wedding, Diana called me out of the blue. We hadn't talked much since everything happened, just occasional texts checking in. She asked if we could meet for coffee and I agreed, curious what she wanted to discuss. We met at a cafe downtown on a Saturday morning. Diana looked nervous as she stirred her latte. She told me Rebecca had started dating someone new, a guy she met through work who seemed normal and kind. Diana said Rebecca seemed different now, more humble and less worried about what other people thought of her. She wasn't posting constantly on social media or bragging about expensive things anymore. Diana thought Rebecca was actually growing as a person and working on herself. I listened and told Diana I was glad Rebecca was doing better, but I wasn't ready to rebuild our relationship yet. The hurt was still too fresh and trust didn't come back overnight. Diana nodded and said she understood, that she just wanted me to know Rebecca was changing. 3 months later, Kyle came home from work with the biggest smile on his face. He'd gotten a promotion to senior analyst with a significant raise, almost double what he'd been making before. I hugged him, and we celebrated right there in our apartment kitchen. That weekend, he took me to dinner at an upscale Italian restaurant downtown. While we were looking at the menu, he made a joke about how now he finally made enough money to be worthy of grandmother's rings, according to Rebecca's standards. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my water. It felt good to finally find humor in what had happened. We spent the rest of dinner talking about his new position and what the raise meant for our future. The waiter brought us complimentary dessert when Kyle mentioned we were celebrating. A month after that, my parents called asking if I would consider having dinner with Rebecca. They said she'd been asking about me and wanted a chance to apologize properly. I hesitated, but Kyle encouraged me to at least hear her out. I agreed on the condition that we meet in a public restaurant, and Kyle would be there with me. My parents set it up for the following weekend at a family-style restaurant near their house. Rebecca arrived looking nervous, her hands shaking as she sat down across from us. She apologized again, but this time it felt different. Her voice broke with real emotion, and she didn't make any excuses for what she'd done. She admitted she'd been jealous of my relationship with grandmother for years, always feeling like she came second. She said she made terrible choices because of that jealousy, and she was sorry for the pain she caused. Tears ran down her face as she talked. I listened without interrupting, letting her get it all out. When she finished, I told her I accepted her apology, but trust would take years to rebuild. She needed to understand that what she did damaged our relationship in ways that wouldn't heal quickly. Rebecca nodded and wiped her eyes. She said she understood completely and didn't expect me to forgive her right away. She told us she'd been in therapy for 6 months working on her jealousy and entitlement issues. Her therapist was helping her understand why she felt the need to compete with me over everything. We agreed to start with occasional supervised family gatherings and see how things went from there. My parents looked relieved that we were at least talking. The check came and Kyle insisted on paying, making another joke about his promotion that actually made Rebecca smile a little. Almost a year after Rebecca's canceled wedding, Kyle and I decided to host Thanksgiving dinner at our apartment. We'd moved to a bigger place with his raise and had room for family gatherings now. My parents came and so did Kyle's mom and his brother. Rebecca showed up with her new boyfriend, a quiet guy named Josh who worked as an accountant. He seemed nice and normal, not flashy or trying to impress anyone. The day was awkward at first, with everyone being overly polite and careful about what they said. But as dinner went on, things relaxed a bit. I noticed Rebecca looking at grandmother's ring on my hand while I was carving the turkey. She wasn't staring with that bitter jealousy she used to have. It was more like she was just admiring it, maybe remembering grandmother. Josh helped clear the table without being asked and talked sports with Kyle. Rebecca stayed quiet most of the meal but thanked me genuinely when they left. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was progress. That winter, I decided to write about my experience anonymously on a legal advice forum. I wanted to help other people dealing with family theft, who might not know they had options. I detailed everything that happened, the evidence I gathered, how I pursued both criminal and civil cases, and what the outcomes were. I posted it late one night and went to bed not expecting much response. By morning, hundreds of comments had poured in. People shared their own stories of family members stealing jewelry, money, even houses. Several people said my advice about documentation and having witnesses present helped them decide to pursue their own cases. One woman messaged me privately saying she'd been hesitating to report her sister for stealing their mother's engagement ring, but reading my story gave her the courage to file a police report. It felt good to turn something painful into something that could help others. Spring came and Diana called with exciting news. She'd gotten engaged to her longtime boyfriend and wanted both Rebecca and me to be bridesmaids. I agreed immediately because Diana had been honest when it mattered most at Rebecca's canceled wedding. The first dress fitting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at a bridal boutique across town. I arrived early and was looking at bridesmaid dress options when Rebecca walked in. We stood there for a moment. Then Diana came out of the dressing room and broke the tension by pulling us both into a group hug. While we waited for our turn to try on dresses, Rebecca and I had our first real conversation in over a year. We talked about Diana's happiness and her fiancé, about wedding planning stress and vendor problems. We didn't mention our own drama at all. It felt almost normal, like we were just sisters again for a few minutes. Diana tried on her wedding dress and we both cried watching her twirl in front of the mirror. Around the same time, Kyle and I decided to start trying for a baby. We'd been married almost 2 years and felt ready to expand our family. One night while we were lying in bed, I twisted grandmother's ring around my finger and thought about how it would eventually pass to my daughter someday. I would tell her the whole story of how it was lost and found, about fighting to get it back and what it represented. The ring meant even more to me now because I'd refused to let it go. Kyle asked what I was thinking about, and I told him. He kissed my forehead and said our daughter would be lucky to have such a strong mom. Diana's wedding arrived in early fall at a vineyard outside the city. Rebecca and I worked together as bridesmaids without major problems. We helped Diana get into her dress, fixed her veil when it got caught, and made sure all the details were perfect. During the ceremony, Diana asked Rebecca to hold her bouquet while she exchanged rings. Rebecca handled them carefully, then made a quiet joke afterward about being trusted with rings again. It actually made me laugh, which surprised both of us. We weren't close like we used to be, but we could exist in the same space without anger. It wasn't forgiveness yet, just progress toward eventual healing. The reception was beautiful, and Rebecca's boyfriend Josh asked me to dance during one of the slow songs, saying he wanted to get to know Kyle's wife better. 2 years after everything happened, I found out I was pregnant with my first child. Kyle and I celebrated privately for a few days before telling anyone else. When we finally shared the news with family, everyone was thrilled. A week later, a package arrived at our apartment. Inside was a beautiful handmade baby blanket in soft yellow and white, clearly made with care and skill. The note attached said it was from Rebecca, hoping she could be a good aunt someday when I was ready. I held the blanket for a long time, feeling its weight and the hours of work she'd put into it. Then I took a photo of grandmother's ring on my hand, holding the blanket, and texted it to Rebecca with the caption about how grandmother would have loved being a great-grandmother. Rebecca responded with just a heart emoji, but it felt genuine. I showed Kyle the blanket and the text exchange. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his hands on my barely there baby bump, and said it looked like we were finally moving forward.